to say something about the politics of climate change. And in a way that's easier than before December 15. Because as you all know, last month in Paris, finally, the world agreed a global agreement on climate change. Now I understand from one of the previous interventions that that is a very, very minuscule effort. Having been dealing with the international climate negotiations for many years, I can tell you, no, it's not. And maybe when you have 195 governments who applaud this, business, cities, NGOs, scientists, maybe that's sort of indication that it was not nothing that was agreed. How come else that the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, all kind of international institutions would say this is a milestone? For years, internationally, we have been witnessing what I call the after-user game. You know, US saying we are not moving until China moves. China saying, but we are not moving until the Americans move. And so not a lot has happened. That was what was killed in Paris. We stopped the after-user game. Now everybody is on board. Big countries as well as small countries, developed countries as well as developing countries, all of them have now pledged to pursue a more low-carbon development strategy, a low-carbon growth strategy. We could argue a lot about that agreement. Is it strong enough? Is it binding enough? There wasn't a global price on CO2. There's still a lot of work to do for politicians in years to come, without doubt. But why is it that there was this unison praise, finally we got the deal? Because it did what politics can do. It set the direction. It put the world on a sort of trajectory towards a low carbon growth. And the big benefit was also that everyone was on board, not just a handful or some handfuls, but everybody. Yes, some of us would always like to see more ambition, but then we would not have had everybody on board. Some would have loved only to see sort of a bottom-up, each country do what they want, but then we would not have enough reductions. So what has been created now, you could say, is sort of a hybrid, very much bottom-up, but still with some common ways of measuring and meeting to see, are we actually collectively on track? You could call the Paris Agreement the art of the possible, and that is often what politics is all about. I've heard this argument sometimes. Business is ahead of governments. Cities are running ahead of governments. And sorry, I do not really subscribe to that. Yes, you have the lonely frontrunners, and that's extremely good. But the bulk of business, the bulk of cities, they are not moving until they see the signals from the top, from governments. Why is that? And that's here I'm going to explain a bit about why has it been so difficult? Why is it so difficult to handle a complex issue like climate change at a global level? Well, we have global markets. We have a more and more globalized economy. We have globalized trade, meaning we have also globalized competition. So of course it's tempting if you're a country to say, why should I move if my competitor is not moving? But unless one believes that the market automatically will solve this enormous challenge of climate change, then you also need a global political framework within which countries feel confident that I can move because my competitors, they are moving as well. Now, that it's difficult to solve global challenges, that's not a prerogative for climate change. You could talk about disarmament. You could talk about Iran or Syria or many other global challenges. it's difficult for the world to agree politically on the global challenges because the global political institutions are relatively weak compared to how much economic forces and other forces have globalized. That's also why it's interesting that in 2015, we saw not only a climate deal in Paris, but we actually also saw agreement at the UN in September on the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, not just for a few group of countries, those goals, they are for all kind of countries. Why has it been so difficult to agree on these things? It's because the world has been structured around sort of the old north-south paradigm since the 70s or even before. Those in the north were the rich north. They had to do something, they had to cope with things, they had to finance it. And then the south would not necessarily have to be sort of part of that. Now we move from that north-south paradigm into a paradigm of mutual interdependency. That's also why the climate change negotiations have been so difficult, because by doing that in the climate change area, we are actually paving a new way of thinking in the whole UN system. That's not a small thing, it's a very important thing. Also, of course, there are really many interests involved here, legitimate interests. Climate change is extremely complex. It's about development, it's about energy. Where do you get your energy from? It's about what kind of economic growth you want. It's about where the jobs would come from in the future. It's about geopolitics. So if you are Saudi Arabia and you are living from selling oil, you are not sort of a born enthusiastic climate change sort of negotiator. You would not like to see such an agreement. If you're India and you still have 300 million citizens without access to electricity, you would talk a lot about the developed country's historic responsibility for having created the problem, where India, by the way, is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. So there are really many, I could mention many more countries with special interest in this. But that was why it meant a lot when the Chinese leadership and the American leadership finally sort of said, okay, we know we have a special responsibility, so we will be joining Europe, the progressive Latin Americans, others of the progressives in trying to get this deal done. And of course, also the costs play a significant role. You know, the first thing we have to understand about climate change is that business as usual also come at a high price. If we don't get that, then it's, of course, true, you can make all sorts of calculations, and it seems like tremendously expensive to do something about climate change. But the thing is, if you don't do anything, it is even more expensive. Really, to grasp this is extremely important. And then, of course, it means a lot whether you have the alternatives to the traditional fossil fuel economy. And there it's true that when we started with wind, when we started with solar, with renewables, the cost was relatively higher than fossil fuels. And still, if you just want the cheapest possible energy source, you should choose coal. That is the cheapest thing, no doubt about it. But the interesting thing that has happened in recent years is that because some countries deliberately started really putting emphasis and developing renewables, the cost curve on renewables have come down tremendously. Solar today is more or less competitive without support. Land-based wind will be competitive in the next 3 to 4 years. That's not a small thing. That's a fantastic thing. And I do not know how many of you know. Now we heard that 2015 and before that 2014 was the hottest year ever. But actually 2014 was also the year where globally more new energy capacity was installed that was renewable than was fossil. It's a game changer. It's substantial. It's extremely important. I would argue that Europe has played a role in that with setting its targets for reducing emissions before others did, putting a price on CO2 and getting standards and regulations in place. But we are also showing that if you do it right, you can actually create a lot of jobs out of this, and you can create a lot of export possibilities out of this. Just one figure. Today in Germany, the biggest state in Europe, they have more jobs in the renewables industry than they had in the old sort of strong coal mining industry. If we had endless time, I think we could skip the political part. If we had endless time, we could just leave it to the market, that eventually the market would find the solutions. But that's here, I think, that in the 21st century, addressing complex issues, we really have to listen to science. What else can you do as a policymaker? And I believe that their time is of essence. That's why we need politics to push things further, faster than would else have been the case. It's not an easy thing. The winners are not exactly the same as the losers. The short-term investments are felt now, but the long-term gains are felt later. In order to get it right on climate, we need more cross-cutting thinking to address a complex issue than silo thinking. There are so many challenges to the way that we normally structure our societies. But I would argue that with Paris, the politicians, all the governments of the world have managed to send a very important signal, giving the direction. I would agree that we need a lot of research, for instance. That will not come automatically. There you need the political signal saying, this is the direction we are going in. We need to price externalities. It must be expensive to waste resources or to pollute. It must come at a price. We must change the investment patterns away from fossil fuels and more into the alternatives. We must stop subsidizing fossil fuels, just to mention a few of the things that is now in the follow-up to Paris. So Paris is only setting the direction. A climate deal in itself does not reduce anything, obviously, but it can set a direction and it can make us invest more in the right growth direction than what we have been doing for too long, investing more in the society of yesterday than in the society of the 21st century. And in the 21st century, any responsible politician, or for that matter, business person or citizen, will have to invest for a low carbon growth. If not, you are ignoring science, and I don't think we can afford that. Thank you.